I feel my most creative when I'm surrounded by my community, when we're pulling stories from deep within ourselves, like flowers blooming from a garden that were planted by seeds that were there long before we knew they were. The most poignant memory of feeling this way was in my early childhood in Lusaka, Zambia. Specifically, when I used to visit my grandparents on their small white bungalow home situated on a farm in Lusaka. We would gather there for special occasions like Christmas, and my extended family and I would fill each room of their home. I recall being small enough for my head to reach the top of the countertop, standing in their kitchen as my mother and my aunties laughed and gossiped over chopped vegetables and frying meats, and hearing the deep rumble of my uncles and my dad as the men debated and talked politics and religion. Because of the familial companionship they had with one another, they were able to point in each other's faces and challenge each other, but it was all from a place of love and excitement to see each other again after a long time. And the memory of the static from the TV in the sitting room as my grandparents watched the 6 p.m. or the 7 p.m. nightly news. I remember how at peace they were to have their whole family in their home, as each of us grandchildren ran from room to room, running outside and picking up dirt on our legs, as our mothers told us not to bring that dust into the home that we were carrying on our feet. My grandparents' home wasn't filled with the leather-bound spines of books. Instead, it had a library of voices that inspired in me a creativity amongst Black people who I was so fortunate to be raised by. However, in 2003, my immediate family and I moved from Zambia to Australia, and from the age of 7, Australia was the place I began to call home. At the time, I don't think I fully understood how much was changing and the ocean distance that would be created between me and the voices that sang in joy that had initially raised me. As time wore on, a distance grew between myself and the cousins who I once ran around the house with, as our bond began to grow distant and we couldn't inspire it further as we weren't close to one another anymore. I wasn't there for important milestones with my grandparents. I wasn't there to see them grow older, celebrate birthdays, or to nurse them as they got sicker and sicker. And even though I created new communities here in Australia, that freshness lacked the deep history that comes with having a family who remind you of your origin and your history and entrust in you the ability to continue a lineage in your blood. I often wondered if it would have been better for me to have been born in Australia so I wouldn't have a memory of what I had lost. As much as I enjoyed my home here, there was just a lot that I could never quite get used to. How a lot of the stores struggled to carry products that worked well with my hair. How my school friends didn't understand the cultural practices it took to do hair for a Black girl. The casualness in which people spoke to their elders that I wasn't familiar with. The segregation that people had with religion that wasn't what was going on in my home life, where Christianity played a huge role in the way my parents raised me. The inability to talk to my parents with the casualness that everybody else did, and the way in which all people in my peer group got to have a rebellious phase that I never got to. There was never that outlet in which I could express what it was like being Zambian amongst other people who would get it, because their backgrounds were more likely than not white Australian. I found a lot of solace in spaces like libraries, and I searched through the bookshelves to find a story that could make meaning out of what I was going through. But even in this media landscape, I soon learned that Australian stories didn't see people who looked like me. If there were ever any Black or African characters, they were more likely than not an offensive caricature that didn't depict what I had been raised by, and that was vastly contrasting to the home life that my family had shown me. Or they were relegated to the corners of a story to be inconsequential characters in the grand scheme of a book. I started to question, was I being seen here? Later on in my life, in my early 20s, I had this wonderful opportunity to attend a panel event where I got to see Black Australian writers with a Black lineage speaking. There they were launching their book, Growing Up African in Australia, and I got to hear Maxine Beneva Clark and Ahmed Youssef describe the book that they had edited. They also used a term titled Third Culture Kid, and for one of the first times, I got to give a name to the type of identity that I was growing up in. Somebody who had a lineage in another country, but was primarily raised here in Australia, and was made up of multiple cultures that didn't exactly fit well together, but which managed to make who I was as a person. I left that panel discussion invigorated, and I decided that I should dedicate the rest of my time spent with any form of media promoting Black writers and Black stories. And I went home and created a book Instagram dedicated specifically to Black stories. The reception that I got from people reading the reviews of books by Black American authors, Black British authors, Black Caribbean authors, and where I could, Black Australian authors, was really invigorating. And after that, I kept on going. But before long, people started to challenge and ask if there was ever going to be an opportunity for this type of book reading to be more communal. A friend told me how much she liked my Instagram and suggested that I create a book club. The idea of it initially sounded completely foreign to me, and I was worried and apprehensive that it was just an idea that nobody would jump on board for. A year went past from this idea, and after speaking to the Center for Stories, I got the chance to create the Afro-Heritage Book Club and use their space for my first meeting. When I created the Instagram post advertising it, I was astounded to see people following the page and also liking the post and commenting excitement. But I initially thought this was just smoke and mirrors. So I attended my first meeting, afraid, but determined, and was just ready to see who would show up when the day came. I sat in a room filled with hard and paperback books from the floor to the ceiling and said, whoever comes through that door will be whoever I meet today. And as I waited, as the afternoon wore on, Black people of all ages and genders poured through the room, commented how excited they were to be there, and faces in awe that we got to meet in a place with this many books. We gathered to talk about the same book that had initially inspired my reading, Growing Up African in Australia. And people who had gathered for that book club couldn't stop talking about how they found themselves in each of the pages. Even though we met because of that book, people started to pour out their own stories and tell me more about themselves. And there was such a diversity and a myriad of ways in which we had all come into this country and found a way to make it our homes. While sitting there, I soon realized that I had recreated the library of voices I had been raised by and given everybody around me the opportunity to do what my uncles and my mothers and my grandparents had done, a space for us to debate and challenge each other and bring stories and laugh and gossip in a safety net around one another. This is why my creativity is inspired by being around community. When I get the opportunity to create a platform for those around me to realize that they are made up of an infinite amount of stories, and whenever they're with me, there's always a space for their stories to be heard.